So my topic is Foucault and Marxism. My talk will take 55 minutes, maximum an hour. In the order of things, Michel Foucault argues that Marxism, quote, exists in 19th century thought like a fish in water. That is, it is unable to breathe anywhere else, end of quote. And he maintains that at the beginning of the 19th century, a fundamental change in the code of knowledge of different disciplines took place. Up to the threshold of this epoch, the concept of true knowledge had been correlated with supratemporal ordering principles. Now, a profound historicity settled into the heart of things. That is an expression Foucault uses, the heart of things. Foucault claims that the conviction that things turn around themselves disappeared in this shift, and an inner connection between the historicity and the history of humanity emerged. The human being as a historical being moved to the center of Western knowledge. According to Foucault, half empirical, half philosophical anthropology was to form the scientific basis for new humanisms. Foucault classifies Marxism with an arrangement of knowledge that emerged at the beginning of the 19th century, quote, which accommodated simultaneously the historicity of economics in relation to the forms of production, the finitude of human existence in relation to scarcity and labor, and the fulfillment of an end of history, whether in the form of an infinite deceleration or in that of a radical reversal, end of quote. David Ricardo's national economics and Marxism form two contrary poles in this arrangement of knowledge. According to Ricardo, the Earth's natural resources set insurmountable limits to the world's population striving for material well-being. Economic activities that ignore these limits are accordingly useless and damaging in the long run. Ricardo takes a long-term slowdown and an eventual cessation of the growth that had steadily advanced in Western countries over the course of industrialization to be inevitable. Marxism counters Ricardo's pessimism, as Foucault puts it, with a revolutionary promise of a future communist society that could satisfy the natural needs of all human beings. This promise is based, on the one hand, on the assumption that through technological innovations, the Earth's natural resources can be used in an even more effective and environmentally friendly way, and on the other hand, on the assurance that human beings in a post-capitalist society will return to their natural needs, whereas the capitalist economy must constantly manufacture new needs to maintain its expansive dynamic. Foucault's thesis that the arrangement of knowledge in the 19th century revolves around the human being as a historical being is corroborated by Marxism's emancipatory goal. Marx writes in his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, quote, to be radical is to grasp the root of the matter, but for man the root is man himself, end of quote. However, this does not mean Marx declares human beings to be the creators of themselves. This must be kept in mind as Foucault charges the arrangement of knowledge in the 19th century with greatly overestimating the formative power of human beings. He speaks in the order of things of the chimeras of the new humanisms, to which one must object, quote, that man is a recent invention that will disappear again as soon as that knowledge has discovered a new form, end of quote. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx concretizes his thesis, men make their own history, with a qualification, quote, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered given and transmitted from the past. End of quote. Engels emphasizes in his Dialectics of Nature that human beings can only consciously shape their living conditions when they have acquired insight into their historical genesis. He there takes up the definition of labor from his and Marx's writing, The German Ideology. Labor is, to quote Engels, the prime basic condition for all human existence, and this to such an extent that in a sense we have to say that labor created man himself. End of quote. Engels connects this definition of labor to Darwin's theory of evolution in his Dialectics of Nature. Quote, animals also have a history, that of their descent and gradual evolution to their present condition. This history, however, is made for them, and in so far as they themselves take part in it, it occurs without their knowledge and desire. On the other hand, the more the human beings become removed from animals in the narrow sense of the word, the more they make their history themselves, consciously. End of quote. The point of this passage is that we can only make, that is, consciously shape, history ourselves when we know how it is made, that is, when we know its structural principles. The science of history that Marx and Engels conceived in The German Ideology should fathom out these structural principles. According to the German ideology, they can be found in a purely empirical way. Since Marx and Engels want to base the future perspective of a communist society that surpasses the dominance of the human beings over human beings on empirically demonstrable structural principles of history, their science of history accords in exemplary fashion with Foucault's statement that the historical anthropology drawn up in the 19th century, which was to form the basis of new humanisms, is half empirical, half philosophical. According to Foucault, the experiences of the 20th century have rendered the narratives of progress from the 18th and 19th centuries obsolete. In a 1978 interview, he connects his thesis that Marxism is bound to the now superseded intellectual horizon of the 19th century to the fact that Marx and Engels' prophecy that the state would wither away under communism has not proven true in the 20th century in those countries that have put their theory into practice. Foucault judges this to be evidence of the failure of the attempt, undertaken in paradigmatic fashion by Marx and Engels, to anchor a political utopia in a science of history that trusts in the formative power of human beings. Foucault claims that the unrealistic features of Marx and Engels' projection of a communist society can be traced back to the deficiencies of their analysis with respect to social power relationships. He maintains Marxism had overestimated the significance of the economy and of the system of interests it sustains, and could not adequately illuminate the general functional context of power. However, Foucault qualifies his claim that Marxism is obsolete by conceding that Marx expresses a specific kind of truth, such that the historical event of his achievements cannot simply be passed over. In the following, I bracket the Marxist projection of a socialist or communist society and instead focus on the question of the role the economy plays in the power structures of modern societies. Foucault's lectures on the history of governmentality from 1977 to 1979 are dedicated to this question. Although Foucault places liberal capitalism in these lectures in a clearly more positive light than Marx and Engels, his structural analysis of capitalist society is thoroughly compatible with the Marxist analysis, as Jacques Bidet has shown in his 2015 book Foucault with Marx. Bidet agrees with Foucault that Marxism overestimated the influence of the economy on social power structures. According to Bidet, these structures rest on the reciprocal relationship between two social forces, the economy and the state institutions. Bidet claims that Marx neglects the constitutive role of the state organization in social power structure. And this deficit can be rectified, Bidet maintains, through recourse to Foucault. Foucault and Bidet's charge that Marxism draws a distorted picture of social power relationships through its overemphasis on the economy is indeed supported by Marx's Capital, but it cannot be leveled at Marx and Engels' theories as a whole. The guiding thesis of the remarks that follow is that the systematic shortcomings of Foucault's theory of governmentality can be rectified by recourse to the Marxist basis superstructure theorem when this latter is understood in a non-reductionist sense. After providing a brief overview of Foucault's theory of governmentality, I will then try and establish this thesis. In the concluding part of my lecture, I outline Joseph Vogel's innovative synthesis of Foucault's conception of governmentality with the Marxist concept of capital. Vogel thereby corrects Foucault's all too pithy and exaggerated critique of Marxism. Now the next part is dedicated to Foucault's theory of modern governmentality. Foucault's concept of governmentality refers to the specific type of power that emerged in Europe in the replacement of the local and fragmented semi-state territories of the Middle Ages by the centralized state of modernity. The essential issue in the new art of government consisted, according to Foucault, in the introduction of the economy into political practice. An efficient administration had to be built to exercise power in the form of the economy. The art of government thus became political science. Unlike feudalistic rulership practices, modern governmental rationality does not aim at getting subjects to obey the sovereign's will, but it rather seeks to establish economic and social structures, quote Foucault, which, through calculation, analysis and reflection, one knows can really have an effect on the population, end of quote. The governmental type of power has, quote Foucault, the population as its main target, political economy as its main major form of knowledge, and apparatuses of security as its essential technical instrument, end of quote. With apparatuses of security, Foucault means an ensemble of institutions and discourses whose major function at a given historical moment is that of responding to an urgent need, exempli gratia, to a state of emergency. The general emergency that first drove 17th and 18th century governments to establish security apparatuses was the food shortage that repeatedly afflicted their populations. Since the modern administrative state sees increasing productivity as one of its core tasks, it therefore draws on political economy, which was established as an independent science in the 17th century. According to Foucault, the introduction of economy into political practice constitutes the essential issue of the new type of government. Measures recommended by the then contemporary political economy for alleviating food shortages and the concomitant improvement of medical care benefit the population, at least in the long term. But these same measures also have a power political dimension, because raising the general standard of living prevents revolts caused by hunger and destitution and provides the resources needed to maintain a powerful and effective army. The modern administrative state's apparatuses of security, therefore, also include constructing a capable infrastructure, introducing quality controls of goods, improving health care, and educational system, both of which ensured a sufficient number of qualified workers and helped to secure military power. A governmental security apparatus' strategic function is to establish and consolidate biopower. Foucault defines the latter as a political power, quote, that had assigned itself the task of administering life, end of quote. In this sense, it is a power that was exercised over life. Its point of access to life include the disciplines established in the 17th century, including processes of progressive training in French dressage and permanent control in schools, factories or production plants and the army. The citizens' training through disciplinary mechanisms aims at the optimization of their capacities, the extortion of their forces, and their integration into systems of efficient and economic controls. Disciplinary mechanisms are, to quote Foucault, techniques of normalization, end of quote, in the sense that they turn efficiency into the norm and thereby separate those unsuitable or incapable from the normal majority. For Foucault, these disciplines and the apparatuses of security form the two reciprocally related poles of biopower. Foucault wants to show that economic processes and the institutional framework of the bourgeois state are reciprocally conditioning in the capitalist form of society. He rejects the assumption that there was, quote, a peculiar and simple truth of capitalism, or of capital and accumulation of capital, end of quote, that can be used to explain the historical transition from feudalism to capitalism. Foucault's critique is directed against the reductionist version of the Marxist basis superstructure theorem that states that economic relations determine the make-up of every society as a whole. In Capital, Marx had argued for this reductionist version of the theorem with respect to the bourgeois capitalist form of society. He there claims that bourgeois law, which enshrines private ownership of the means of production, is a mere epiphenomenon of the capitalist economy. Nevertheless, Foucault himself retains the conceptual pair basis superstructure in his work, albeit in a form that is strongly modified as compared to Marxism. Now, basis and superstructure in Foucault's social theory. Foucault's thesis that power comes from below situates the state in the superstructure of society. Foucault uses this term himself, superstructure, in the sense that, quote, it can only function on the basis of previously existing power relations. Foucault uses the concept of the basis referring to the totality of force relationships below the state apparatus. In his view, quote, the manifold relationships of force that take shape and come into play in the machinery of production, in families, limited groups and institutions, are the basis for wide-range effects of cleavage that run through the social body as a whole, end of quote. These coalesce into a functional net that, according to Foucault, does not have a central point and is unstable due to ceaseless struggles. Foucault assigns the so understood basis of every society and the state superstructure two different, quote, strategies for integrating these unbalanced, heterogeneous, unstable, and tense force relations, end of quote. In his eyes, these can be coded either in the form of war or in the form of politics, which, however, does not constitute a dichotomy, as it can be argued that politics is the continuation of war by other means. Foucault subsumes the phenomena of antagonism, rivalry, clashes, struggles between individuals or groups or classes under the term war. He is thus convinced that social relations are thoroughly dominated by conflicting interests that give rise to power struggles, resulting in an asymmetry of power positions. In modernity, the political strategy for, quote Foucault, integrating these unbalanced, heterogeneous, unstable and tense for relations, end of quote, that is, governmentality, is on the one hand a program that stands in contrast to the continuous battle in the social basis for the governmental nexus of apparatuses of security and disciplines, advances the economic prosperity that benefits the population, at least in the long term. On the other hand, the asymmetrical power positions in the social basis are reflected in the state superstructure, meaning that the war in the basis continues in the superstructure. Axel Honneth pointed out the systematic problem that arises from this interpretation of the conceptual pair basis-superstructure. Foucault illustrates his thesis that the social basis has no structural center, using the image of a moving substrate where the manifold local confrontations lead to constant redistributions, realignments, homogenizations, serial arrangements, and convergences of power positions. How can the countervailing political strategy of integrating antagonistic forces into stable institutional structures emerge from such a martial dynamics? Foucault can only explain this, as Honneth rightly I think establishes, by importing the principle of self-organization from systems theory. According to this latter, the manifold local relationships of force and power positions in the social basis interlink themselves dynamically into stable systems. The system-theoretical approach, however, runs counter to Foucault's characterization of the basis as an incessant war. From a systems theory perspective, the enmity that provokes and perpetuates war shapes at most the protagonist's self-understanding, while the social theorist discovers the cunning of reason working behind their backs, that turns that struggle into productive confrontations, and thereby generates political structures that promote the common interest of the conflicting parties, thus pacifying their conflicts. Foucault's social theory thus gets entangled in an aporia. The system-theoretical perspective is incompatible with the thesis that the political technology of power is founded in war as the code of the social basis. There is also an ambiguity in Foucault's concept of war that undermines its explanatory power. By attributing a specific strategy for integrating force relationships to war, Foucault follows usual linguistic practice according to which wars are waged between states, peoples, or in the case of civil war, social groups that must cooperate in the struggle against their enemy. This understanding of war, however, is relegated to the background in Foucault's characterization of basal force relationships in every society as a continual battle. For his thesis that struggles are always local and in the form of clashes played out in one moment, and that force relationships are constantly unstable is synonymous with saying that the overarching command and cooperation mechanisms that are indispensable in a real war are absent here. This is confirmed in Foucault summing up this image of continual war in the formula, "We all fight against all." Foucault's conception of war thereby becomes fatally ambiguous. If these incessant local confrontations, which he believes permeate the social basis, are understood as a war of all against all, then the strategies for integrating social force relationships, that is, the cooperative structures, that Foucault declares to be the definitions of the two concepts in his contrast of war and politics, completely disappear. This consequence can only be avoided if the formula "we all fight against all" is dropped, and we adhere to the notion that the phenomena of antagonism, rivalry, clashes, struggles are interlinked with cooperative structures in every society, so long as it does not slide into anarchy. Foucault can thus only hold to his definition of war and politics as two forms of integrating force relationships if he accepts the standpoint Plato has already argued for in Republic, namely, that no social actors can assert their interests single-handedly, but only in relying upon cooperative partners, even if these change. But then, the application of the term war to all phenomena of antagonism, rivalry, clashes, struggles in the social basis would only be possible at the price of putting quarrels between cooperative partners about the appropriate means for set common objectives, or scientific disputes on the same level as conflicts in which the contending parties damage the vital interests of the opposition. The word war thereby loses determinate content. Antagonisms, rivalries, and competitions between cooperative partners can generate productive powers by spurring them to excel in the pursuit of common interests, for example through finding innovative solutions. The destructiveness of real war disappears in such struggles over a shared issue. The totality of basal force relations of a society cannot be subsumed under the term war as Foucault had intended. This also rendered dubious his image of a moving substrate of local, unstable relationships of force and states of power. If the cooperative structures that every social actor relies upon always remain fragile, no stable and encompassing power-knowledge complex, such as the natural science of modernity, along with its technical applications and government power technologies, could be formed. The explanatory claim that Foucault makes in intertwining the conceptual pairs of basic superstructure and war and politics can only be maintained of liberal bourgeois capitalism, albeit not in the radical form of a struggle of all against all, and only then when one restricts the concept of basis in the Marxist sense to the economic sphere and understands how the state superstructure is founded in the basis in a non-reductionist way and in terms of a reciprocally conditioning relationship. Liberal capitalism became established in Europe and the United States at the end of the 18th century. In the early capitalism of the 16th to 18th century, mercantilism was the dominant form of governmentality. It elevated the state, which was becoming increasingly bureaucratized, to the position of a central economic management body. Mercantilist economic policy goes hand in hand with the centralization of state power since the 16th century. Under absolutism, the territorial sovereign becomes, quote Foucault, the architect of the disciplined space. Discipline manufactures individuals, end of quote, by training them in the skills and readiness to perform given functions. In the schools open to larger segments of the population in the age of mercantilism, docility and obedience were required. Mercantilism reached its limits in the profound economic crisis in France in the run-up to the 1789 revolution. A hyper-administrative state emerged through progressive bureaucratization. It inhibited business initiative, which is essential to the capitalist market economy. Classical economics, which was founded by Adam Smith and provided the theoretical framework for liberal economic policy, rejected any kind of state dirigism. The replacement of mercantilism by classical liberalism included a self-limitation of governmental reason. The rationality of minimal government, which classical economics saw as liberating the mechanism of the market, proved to be, quote Foucault, the organizational principle of the state interest itself, end of quote. The market economy became a source of enrichment, of growth, and consequently of power for the state. It enables a growth in productivity that led to a sustained increase in state revenues. While liberalism breaks with the state-centeredness of mercantilism in terms of economic policy, it ties in with it in terms of population policy. The disciplinary mechanisms established in early capitalism made possible the, quote Foucault, controlled insertion of bodies into the production apparatuses, end of quote, of liberal industrial capitalism. In the mercantilist era, a strict regiment of time was enforced in schools, manufactories, and military drill. It was perfected in factories with introduction of machinery and ended the capitalist concept of productivity as labor output per unit of time. The efficiency criteria of normalization techniques that had guided the socialization process since mercantilism were internalized by individuals, and in the formation of the market economy shaped its paradigmatic actor, the Homo economicus, who pursues his rational self-interest. His success in life depends on whether he succeeds in using his resources, his labor power, his professional qualifications, and his financial resources, if he has them, profitably in the game of supply and demand. When one bears in mind the fact that even egoistic protagonists must enter at least temporary coalitions in order to be able to pursue their interests effectively, Foucault's concept of war as a specific strategy for integrating heterogeneous and unstable force relationships can be applied to the market economy. The fundamental antagonisms of the market economy consist in the opposed interests of the producers of goods or suppliers of services on the one hand, and of the consumers or customers on the other, as well as between business owners and wage earners. Producers and suppliers are interested in high prices, consumers or customers in low. Businesses want to keep the payroll costs low, wage earners want to increase their income. The antagonisms of the market economy go together with rivalries. Businesses compete for market shares, wage earners for workplaces. Hence coalitions between businesses as well as between wage earners, in which both sides seek to strengthen their power positions in labor disputes, are always fragile. The strategy imminent to the market economy for integrating its conflictual force relationships, consists in the play of supply and demand, that Foucault describes as the mechanics of interests. Foucault's thesis that the political superstructure contains on the one hand a strategy for integrating the social force relationships that contrasts with the war in the basis on the one hand, and on the other hand can be seen as a continuation of that war by other means, can be redeemed with reference to a relationship between the capitalist economy and the liberal bourgeois state, but in a modified form as compared to Foucault's original intentions. The bourgeois state belongs in a twofold sense to the superstructure of the capitalist economy. The first aspect, the self-interested economic subject, that is, Homo economicus, is the condition for the function of liberal bourgeois law. This gives every individual the right to the physical integrity of their person, to free disposal of their labor power, and to private property. The power to dispose of one's labor power means it can only be used by others in exchange for wages. Private ownership of the means of production and the contractually regulated work for wages are essential to the capitalist market economy. Liberal bourgeois law is thus tailored to this. It simultaneously constitutes a strategy that counters the market struggle, it's an expression of Max Weber, and that integrates social relationships of force, since the protagonists in the market economy are, as legal subjects, obliged to maintain contracts that were made in their mutual interests. The law incorporates the pursuit of individual interests into a framework that protects and promotes the citizens' common interest. Second aspect, the nexus of the apparatuses of security and disciplines in liberal governmentality is founded in the mechanics of the free market. The self-limitation of governmental reason in liberalism is motivated by the fact that the antagonisms and rivalries of the market economy, which are supposed to ignite sustained economic growth, should also promote the general interest through their inherent dynamic. Adam Smith's image of an invisible hand is coined to describe this process. In free competition between producers and suppliers, those that offer overpriced goods or services will be driven from the market. The lowering of prices increases consumption such that the producers and suppliers of inexpensive goods and services can expand. This spurs economic growth. The increased need for labor power in an economic upswing enables wage earners to push through pay rises in accordance with the law of supply and demand. Consumption possibilities thereby grow. The demand for goods and services increases, which again benefits the producers and suppliers. The economic upswing can thus become self-sustaining. The liberal apparatuses of security belong to the superstructure of the capitalist economy to the extent that these are restricted to creating the legal and political framework for the inherent dynamic of the free market. Liberal disciplinary mechanisms also serve to safeguard the capitalist production process. They enable individuals to perform efficiently and socialize them into conceiving their respective capacities as human capital and into using them to benefit their rational self-interest. The political strategy of liberal governmentality thereby integrates the social force relationships into, quote Foucault, a complex game between individuals and collective interests, between social benefits and economic profit, end of quote. Foucault's characterization of the force relationships situated below the state apparatus as the basis for wide-ranging effects of cleavage that run through the social body as a whole becomes plausible in relation to liberal capitalism, which allows market mechanisms to operate. The power relations between businesses and wage earners in market economy shift in phases of stagnation or recession in favor of the former, for they can reduce business costs through layoffs and can also freeze or even lower wages in the face of the growing unemployment that compels wage earners to take up work even for reduced pay. Since phases of growth and of stagnation or recession regularly follow each other in a market economy, its inherent dynamic favors businesses in the long run. Liberal bourgeois law puts all citizens on the same level in a formal sense, granting everyone the right to the physical integrity of the person, to free disposal of their labor power, and to private property. But it also gives free rein to market mechanisms that create and reinforce social inequality. Quote Foucault, "The historical process through which the bourgeoisie became the politically dominant class in the course of the 19th century had been obscured behind the introduction of an explicit, codified and formally equalitarian legal framework." End of quote. The market struggle thus continues in liberal governmentality. Formal legal equality goes together with social inequality, and thereby also with asymmetric possibilities for influencing politics. Foucault's guiding thesis that power comes from below thus holds of the foundation of liberal governmentality in the capitalist market economy and accords with his ambivalent determination of the relationship between war and politics. On the one hand, the liberal state gains power capital from the economic prosperity resulting from unleashing of the conflictual market forces, and it can use this to promote the general interest. On the other hand, the asymmetric power relationships in the capitalist economy have continually impacted the political sphere. Only in this concrete case can the explanatory claim that Foucault makes by connecting the conceptual pairs basic superstructure and war politics be redeemed. Liberal bourgeois law belongs to the superstructure of the capitalist market economy and at the same time to its functional conditions. The later Engels argued for such a non-reductionist version of the basic superstructure theorem with reference to the then contemporary liberal capitalism. By applying the conceptual pair war politics in this way to the economic basis and the state superstructure of the bourgeois capitalist form of society, we can avoid the aporia that Honneth shows is entailed by Foucault's original understanding of this conceptual pair. The aporia is dissolved with reference to market struggle's relationship to liberal governmentality, when one also recognizes that the two are reciprocally conditioning. The market struggle is not an originally given, and definitely not the paradigm of the social as such. It is the result of the economic political turn from mercantilism with a simultaneous continuation of the disciplinary mechanisms the latter had initiated. These treat individuals as human capital and urge them in the transition to the market economy to pursue their rational self-interest efficiently, thus integrated them into the capitalist machinery of production. The unleashing of the market struggle by liberal governmentality does not run counter to the principle of self-organization in systems theory. Instead, it implements precisely this in the economic sphere. Liberalism wants to put into operation the inherent dynamic of the market, and this is supposed in classical economics to release the forces of growth. Now the last part of my talk, Joseph Vogel's transformation of Foucault's theory of governmentality. Joseph Vogel was counted among the most prominent social scientists in the German-speaking world with an international reputation. Since the publication of his book The Scepter of Capital in 2010, discusses Foucault's history of governmentality in his 2015 book The Souveränitätseffekt. It has been translated into English with the title The Ascendancy of Finance. Vogel adheres to the Marxist intuition, which Foucault opposes, that in capitalism, the relationship between economic processes, the social order, and the governing technologies is organized according to the mechanisms of the reproduction of capital. However, Vogel expands Marx's concept of capital. While capital is at its core private capital for Marx, Vogel provides a reconstruction of the interrelationship between the formation of private capital power and the activation of state power capital in modern governmentality. Vogel works out the key role of government debt in the dynamics of capitalist growth, through which private creditors acquire far-reaching influence on state economic policy. The chapter, The So-Called Primitive Accumulation, in the first volume of Marx's Capital, forms the backdrop to Vogel's tracing the origin of private accumulation of capital in its intertwinement with the capitalization of state power at the beginning of modernity. In this chapter, Marx rebuts the view that the large-scale financial assets needed for the establishment of manufactories and setting up international trade networks were due to assiduous saving on the part of successful master craftsmen and merchants. The investment funds that enabled capitalism to gain traction were partly raised by feudal landlords who appropriated common farming lands and converted them into sheep grazing pastures for the emerging and highly promising textile industry, and the necessary financial resources were partly run from the colonies, as well as partly originating from the system of public credit, it is, of national debts, that became established across Europe in early modernity. Vogel's main interest is the economic and legal institutionalization of national debt, for it forms the historical root of financial capitalism. National debts in medieval feudalism were minor, as weak central governments and the vagaries of royal succession meant their repayment was not guaranteed. State levite taxes in duties also had the character of temporary confiscations born from need that could often only be implemented in the face of resistance. However, the centralized administrative states that started to be set up at the beginning of modernity had significantly greater financial needs. This led to lasting cooperation between private creditors and the government authorities who ensured the repayment of debts. Using the credit they had received, the states then opened up new sources of finance, most especially through profitable military ventures and the construction of an efficient centralized tax system. When speaking of the capitalization of power in modern European states, Vogel emphasizes that they could only secure their administrative and military power with the help of banks and private financiers, where credit-financed increases in state revenue enabled the repayment of debts and interest. The activation of state power capital was accompanied by the establishment of private capital power. National debt provided traders, bankers, and bearers of government bonds with a significant measure of control over public affairs. The co-evolution of the capitalist economy and the centralized administrative state created a reciprocal dependency between both parties. States were reliant on private funders, and these latter were reliant on the payment of national debts. The establishment of central banks gave a permanent legal form to the financing of state activity through credit. Central banks are, quote Vogel, part of governmentalization in modernity and belong to an ensemble of political technologies that aim at increasing state power through an economization of government practice. The accumulation of capital in modernity only became possible in the combination of state authority and private enrichment. End of quote. In contemporary financial capitalism, the original intention of public credit, namely strengthening the power capital of one's own state, has turned into the opposite, as capitalist states become unilaterally dependent on the financial markets. Contemporary financial capitalism took shape following the neoliberal turn in Western economic policy in the 1980s. This neoliberal turn was motivated by stubborn economic stagnation, together with high inflation rates and growing unemployment in capitalist countries in the 1970s. Neoliberalism, which owed its rise to this stagflation, saw a remedy in the freeing of market forces from state control. The expansion of the volume of credit allowed broad sectors of the population with low and middle incomes to make purchases that strict risk assessments had previously denied them. The increase in mass purchasing power through loans initially seemed to have surmounted the stagflation of the 1970s. The world financial crisis showed this to be an illusion. Easing access to credit did not lead to a boost in productivity in the real economy that would have allowed the repayment of debt. The level of wages stayed stagnant for decades. This uncontrolled lending by banks was enormously profitable to both them and large corporations, and thus led directly to the 2008 world financial crisis. In the world financial crisis, Western governments made hitherto inconceivable sums of money available to large banks and corporations who were threatened with bankruptcy due to the default of loans. This rescue program, which was made at the taxpayer's expense, suspended the central tenet of neoliberal economic theory, leaving the economy over to unfettered market forces, and justified this by saying that it was the only way to avoid the collapse of the world economy. The rescue of banks and businesses meant the credit needs of Western states soared to new heights. To meet these needs, central banks have since then been providing cheap money to private banks, which these latter then lent at higher prices to finance the running of the state, and at the same time the central banks have bought the national debt that private banks had previously purchased. The central banks thereby ignore economists' warnings about a lasting expansion of the monetary supply, which entails the risk of inflation. Western politics only brought this warning into play to legitimate limiting social security to a low level and to justify tolerating precarious working conditions. Public finances were consolidated almost exclusively by restricting expenditure after the dramatic increases in national debt in the world financial crisis. The banks rescued with taxpayers' money continued unabated with the very business practices that created the crisis. The profits, salaries and bonuses in the financial sector quickly reached their old heights again. The reaction of Western states to the world financial crisis thus reveals a distribution program, quote Vogel, that structurally and permanently privileges the profit interests of banks, financial institutions, investment companies, portfolio finance, credit cartels, and large-scale capital assets. End quote. According to Vogel, an alliance of state and financial power that wages a class war against the rest of the population is responsible for this. In the world financial crisis, Western states had the chance to make lasting changes to the structures of financial capitalism, as banks and businesses threatened with bankruptcy were reliant on state rescue programs. The argument used to justify the rescue programs, that the survival of these institutions was crucial to preventing a collapse of the world economy, would have even obligated politicians and central banks to fundamentally reform the current system. For if this argument is correct, it necessarily follows that the development that lead to a crisis of this magnitude must not be repeated. However, Western states have not undertaken any sustainable revision to the neoliberal deregulation of their financial sector, nor made any effective efforts through international agreements to raise the tax rate on business earnings and profits from financial transactions. Hence, nothing has changed in the basic structure of the financial capitalism that produced the 2007-2008 credit default, namely the disparity between an inflated financial sector with exorbitant profit margins and a low rate in the real economy. The co-evolution of the private power of capital and state power capital in the bourgeois capitalist form of society since the beginning of modernity provides an explanatory key for why the neoliberal term in response to 1970s stagflation crisis was taken to be the only possibility. Modern governmentality aims at strengthening the biopower of one's own state in competition with other states. Military power initially played a central role here. The public credit system established in Europe at the outset of modernity served to a considerable degree to finance profitable military undertakings. The European great powers achieved global dominance through colonial conquest. Vogel cites the British South Sea Company, which was founded in 1711 and financed the slave trade through granting credit, as an example of the then contemporary private creditors' trust in the most aggressive European nation-building and colonial power campaigns. In classical liberalism too, which sought to use free trade to decrease the escalation potential in interstate conflicts, the interests of one's own state remained the focus of governmentality. Market freedom was allowed in the expectation that it would be a source of enrichment, growth, and consequently of power for one's own state. It therefore would have broken with modern governmentality's fundamental objective, namely increasing the biopower of one's own state in competition with other states, If in the 1970s stagflation crisis and the following decades, Western states had striven to establish internationally binding tax rates for business profits and financial transactions, as well as setting significant social standards instead of wanting to improve their own competition position by creating conditions as favorable as possible for capital. By placing financial capitalism within the history of modern governmentality, Foucault points to its fundamental paradox. Because Western states adhere, under the conditions of a progressive globalized market, to the traditional government concern with increasing the power capital of their own state through an economization of the practice of government, and continued to expect an increase in state capacities from the system of public credit that had served this concern for centuries, they became one-sidedly dependent on the financial markets. The threat of a capital flight and the withdrawal of investment gives economic and political power to the markets. This power explains the way Western states handled the world financial crisis. Rescue programs for banks and large corporations that drastically increased national debts, while also refraining from any fundamental reform of the world economy. This led to the hollowing out of state by market capital and to an erosion of state power. Western states were thereby compelled to cut back on public investment as soon as it burdened the repayment of debt. The original intention of the states in the establishment of the public credit system was thus turned on its head. Instead of providing the means for the state to make fruitful investments, this public credit curtailed its sphere of influence, as the state has to spend a growing share of its income on financing its credit burden. This creates a capital loop. The new loans taken out by the state serve primarily to refinance the old ones. The democratic gains made with the bourgeois legal state are in danger of disappearing in the class warfare waged in Western countries by an alliance of state power with capital. Thank you for your attention.